For those watching from the bank, this was the worst whale watch trip ever. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine, a show about fun and adventure in the outdoors. We do stuff, sometimes unusual stuff, and we put it on the air. Some stuff is so big it won't fit into a single show. For instance, today is part 2 of a first-of-its-kind boat trip up the Penobscot River. And not just any boat. It was the Bar Harbor Whale Watch Friendship 5. And we didn't just go up the river. We departed from Bar Harbor, raced down and around Mount Desert Island, through Eggemogan Reach, onto the Deer Isle Bridge, onto the Penobscot Narrows Bridge, all the way up to the Joshua Chamberlain Bridge. No commercial boat had ever done that before, because there aren't many boats in North America that can carry hundreds of passengers that far, that fast. I got to host that trip. Last weekend, you heard the first half as we motored from Bar Harbor to Bucksport. Coming up, we're going all the way up to Bangor, and we'll get a surprise when we arrive. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Doors Equipment, Bar Harbor Whale Watch, Napa Auto Parts, and EBS. Let's get you up to speed. This trip took place on Saturday, September 10th. It was a beautiful day. There wasn't much wind as we steamed out of Bar Harbor. It picked up a little as we hit our first lighthouse on Bear Island at the entrance of Somes Sound. Then it went dead calm as we headed for Deer Isle and motored into Castine Harbor. On board, we had experts to talk about the 11 lighthouses we'd hit along the way, plus historians and naturalists to tell us all about the colonial history, the famous bridges, and the forts we'd pass, and about the wildlife we'd see, like the porpoises and seals that popped up everywhere we went. If you missed last week's show, we left the dock in Bar Harbor. We stopped at the breakwater.
It's a half mile long. It has 400,000 tons of rock piled up there.
We hit the Bear Island Light.
This is Bear Island over here on the right. Very beautiful lighthouse. 1838, when it was first built.
We headed toward Blue Hill Bay.
In the distance at 1 o'clock, if you're looking out on the horizon, there is the mountain called Blue Hill.
We hit the brakes at Blue Hill Bay Lights.
Originally established 1857, just a little bit before the Civil War.
We went under the Deer Isle Bridge.
The Deer Isle Bridge is a suspension bridge spanning Eggemogan Reach.
We learned all about Paul Revere screwing up in Castine.
Revere is actually brought up on charges of cowardice.
We visited Dice Head Light.
1829, the lighthouse service built a rubble and stone brick tower, 59 feet high.
And we finished the show last week pulling up to the Penobscot Narrows Bridge.
A very pretty picture and not one that you normally get to see.
The voices you'll hear are me, as host and bird identifier, Chief Naturalist Zach Cliver, who you'll hear most of the time, and lighthouse expert Gene Torbeck.
So now we'll go under the bridge. Okay, well, welcome to Fort Knox, which is here at 9 o'clock. This fort, Fort Knox, is now a state park, and it's a historic site. It's in the town of Penobscot, right, which is across from Bucksport, which is here on our right. It was built between 1844 and 1869, and is the first fort in Maine built entirely of granite, not wood. It was named after Major General Henry Knox, who was the first U.S. Secretary of War and the commander of artillery during the American Revolutionary War. You may know that General Knox actually spent a lot of his life in Thomaston, Maine, which is not far from here. The fort was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1970 as an example of mid-19th century granite coastal fortifications. It also served as an entry site for the observation tower with the bridge. The history here, some of this goes back to the British and the battle for the American Revolution, the War of 1812, and a lot of anger toward British in eastern Maine. And this really culminates in 1814 during the War of 1812 when a British naval force and soldiers sailed up the Penobscot and defeated a very outnumbered American force in the Battle of Hamden. The British followed their victory by looting Hamden and Bangor. The American defeat contributed to an effort to make Maine separate from Massachusetts. Since Massachusetts did not defend us at that time, we're not capable of coming here to help fight the British, so there was a real need to create our own military and create statehood that was separate from Massachusetts. So that was a very important factor in Maine actually becoming separate from Massachusetts in 1820. The Aroostook War of 1838-39 exposed the vulnerability of this region to more British attacks, and at that time both Penobscot and Bangor were becoming more and more a source of shipbuilding lumber. So there was a real need for a fort here to protect the resources, protect Maine, and so that is why that effort began in 1844. The initial funding came from Congress, and they gave $1 million towards this effort. The granite was quarried about 5 miles upriver near the town of Frankfort that we'll pass in a little bit. The fort had 2 batteries facing the river, each equipped with a furnace to heat cannonballs sufficiently that they could ignite wooden ships if the ball lodged in the vessel. Fort Knox never did see any battles, though it was manned during the times of war. During the American Civil War, volunteers from Maine, mostly recruits in training before assignment to active duty, manned the fort. A regiment from Connecticut manned Fort Knox during the Spanish-American War. And then after that, at one point, this garrison was reduced just down to 1 man, who was called the keeper of the fort. The keeper attended the condition and maintenance of the fort and reported to Fort Preble in Portland, Maine. In 1923, the federal government declared the fort excess property and put its 125 acres up for sale. The state of Maine bought it for $2,121. We're now going to continue making our way up toward Bangor. We have about a 15-mile boat ride to get up. We should be up in Bangor. It's getting about 15 miles, so somewhere around a half an hour or so from now.
Today's episode of Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine took place September 10th on the Friendship 5, as I got to host this historic Bar Harbor Whale Watch excursion from Bar Harbor to Bangor. It'll take us about half an hour to get up there from here in Bucksport. We'll be eating lunch on the way, and since that's all just too boring for radio, we'll take a break here and meet you up there. I will tell you this. This is the first time I've been up the Penobscot by water. It's not really what I expected. Often when you look at the river from the road in Orrington or Hamden or Winterport, the river looks rather large and wide, but much of it is actually pretty small and narrow. There are houses along the river that you'd never know were there from the road, and there are tranquil patches of forest. There are seals, fish, and eagles. We slow down whenever we pass a dock or marina so as not to jostle boats in our wake. So, when I get back, we'll be in Bangor. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine returns in a moment on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. Welcome back to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is part 2 of a 2-part show. On September 10th, Bar Harbor Whale Watch took a boatload of people from Bar Harbor to Bangor on board the Friendship 5, one of the few commercial boats that could make the round trip in one day. It's fast. And I'm the host. We aired the first half of this trip last weekend. Today's show started in Bucksport and will end back in Bar Harbor by way of Winter Harbor. Yeah, this boat can cruise at 33 miles an hour and cover a lot of water while carrying hundreds of passengers. Right now, we've just crossed the Hamden line heading north. Chief Naturalist Zach Cliver is on the mic.
A lot of interesting piers here with wood, and the banks of the river are quite beautiful. We hope you're enjoying it. And ahead we have... okay, this might be Joshua Chamberlain Bridge, right up ahead of us here, connecting Bangor to Brewer.
Zach, everybody on the top deck wants me to correct you. We're coming up on Veterans Remembrance Bridge. The second bridge will be Joshua Chamberlain. We're coming up with the sewage treatment plants off on our left. People often ask me, where do our ducks go in the winter? There. You come out here in a cold January day, if there's any open water, it's full of mallards, black ducks, other things.
At this point, we go under the Veterans Remembrance Bridge and get a big surprise. September 10th was also the date of the Bangor Car Show. We had expected to turn a few heads as this big whale watch boat came upriver, but we didn't expect the huge crowd and all those classic cars in the Bangor waterfront. A lot of people standing there and just staring at us. Small cruise ships have been up here before, of course, especially for the folk festival. But a whale watch boat?
Well, as you can see, a lot of people in Bangor have turned out to greet us. There's a lot of people in Bangor looking at this boat coming upriver saying, what is that doing here? This is a unique trip. First time it's ever been tried. Probably not the last, because we caught a beautiful day and a great trip so far.
Okay, we had a good question on what is this church back behind the bridge. It is the First Brewer Congregational Church. Building dates back to about the 1880s and was Joshua Chamberlain's church while he was alive. If you look over on the other side, right next to this white car, about 1 o'clock, you'll see one of the cannon recovered from the Penobscot expedition when they were putting in the Chamberlain Bridge. Can't tell from here. I took a look at it closer up a few weeks ago, and it looks to be a long 9-pounder. So it'd fire a 9-pound iron ball, about 3/4 of a mile or so. Very popular with American privateers and warships because the barrel was a little bit longer than the average cannon of the day, which gave it better long-range accuracy for the weight on the ship.
For those watching from the bank, this was the worst whale watch trip ever.
So the Penobscot River is 109 miles long. Of course, there's been a huge effort that's been underway for many years that involves the Penobscot Native Indians, along with the state of Maine, many nonprofit organizations that form together to form the Penobscot River Trust, an effort to restore the Penobscot River and take down dams and open up the river to make it more healthy and have more access for river-going fish. And that has been a huge success.
Well, as we approach another slowdown for the marina here, I can add a few notes about the Penobscot River itself and about the restoration project. This turns out to be evidence that humans can correct their mistakes. For a long time, the Penobscot River was asked to serve just two purposes: generate power and carry away sewage. And as a result, our fisheries pretty much died off here, and this used to be an impressive fishery. Millions of sea-run fish would come up to our lakes to spawn into the river. That all died away. We used to have magnificent salmon runs, Atlantic salmon up this river, and that all disappeared because the dams blocked fish passage. The river itself is not all that old. In its current form, it really only exists since the last ice age. Of course, the Native Americans settled into the area after the last ice age. They're all part of the Wabanaki Nation, so the Indians all had shared a basic language, and most of the state was divided up into pretty well-organized tribes. This area was the Penobscots. Go figure. I'm not sure whether they were named first or the river was, but I suspect the river, because like most Indian place names in Maine, the name refers to an actual spot, an actual physical characteristic of that area. And for the Penobscots, it was a ledge above Bangor towards Indian Island, which was a spot that was easily recognized when you were paddling upstream, and so that was the place where the ledges were. If you see place names that end in keg, that generally meant a place where something happens, something exists. So the Kenduskeg stream that comes into Bangor was placed where the water parsnips are. The Passadumpkeg River, which is just upstream above Old Town and Greenbush, was the place above the gravel bar. So most of the Indian place names, of which still many are in use today, are all about what happened there, what exists there, what resource was there. Even some of the English names were adopted from the original Native American names. So there's a Sugar Island upstream that was actually called Sugar Island by the Indians. There's a Hemlock Island next door, which was actually called Hemlock Island at that time. So the Penobscots have been here a long time. We have a lot of their tradition, even though it's thousands of years old, still reflected here on the Penobscot River. Other place names that make sense, Schoodic Point. Anybody familiar with Schoodic Point in Acadia National Park? Schoodic meant place at the end. And if you've been to the end of Schoodic Point, it is at the end. The actual making of the restoration is pretty exciting because what happened is we didn't actually lose any power generation. The area around Old Town and Orono is sort of an island, and there are two branches of the Penobscot that went around it. The rivers were on, most of the dams were on the main branch. We actually took some of those out and improved the power generation on the other branch, on the Stillwater River. And as a result, we managed to accomplish all of this habitat restoration and restore the health of the river without actually losing much hydropower at all. So if you want to see how Americans can do things more sensibly going into the future, that's a good example. And there are other states that are now looking at this example and saying, hey, we can do that too, because there are places out west that have also lost their salmon fishery as well. So this is a sign of progress, and you got to witness it firsthand.
So, as you can tell, I'm hosting and occasionally narrating this first ever Bar Harbor to Bangor boat trip. We finished in Bangor. We're heading south on the Penobscot River, passing through Hamden, and the day will end back in Bar Harbor. But we've been saving a lot of lighthouses and historic sites for the return trip. And on the way to Bangor, we took the shortest route. But we're on board the Friendship 5. This Bar Harbor Whale Watch boat can carry hundreds of people and still lay rubber. So we're going to hit some lighthouses we missed on the way in. We'll veer way over to a remote part of the Blue Hill Bay for additional lighthouses, and eventually scoot all the way across Frenchman's Bay before returning home. One of those lighthouses we skipped is dead ahead. We'll be up to the Fort Point Lighthouse in about 3 minutes. Meet you there when Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine returns in a moment on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. Saturday mornings at 9, Sunday mornings at 8 on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. You're riding along with me today in the Friendship 5, a Bar Harbor Whale Watch boat big enough to hold hundreds of people, fast enough to go from Bar Harbor to Bangor and back again, stopping at 11 historic lighthouses, 2 historic bridges, and several historic forts along the way. Everybody thinks they know what Maine looks like, but almost all of our view is through a windshield. You don't know what you're missing until you see it from a different angle, this angle. No commercial boat trip has ever done this before, but we did it on a fast, all-aluminum jet-powered catamaran Saturday, September 10th. To this point of the journey, we've come all the way over from Bar Harbor and up the Penobscot River to Bangor. We're now going back downriver, and it's time to visit a lighthouse and fort that marks the entrance to the river. Our onboard expert on lighthouses is Gene Torbeck.
So over here on the right side, we have the Fort Point Light coming up. This light originally established 1836 by order of President Andrew Jackson, and the light pointed the way up the Penobscot River to Bangor, which at that time Bangor was the world's busiest lumber port. This was the first river light in Maine, and the lighthouse gets its name from the adjacent Fort Pownell, built by the order of Massachusetts Governor Pownell to guard against the French. Maine at that time, as we said earlier, was part of Massachusetts. First lighthouse was a granite tower. First keeper was William Cluley, who had sold his land to the government for the station. In 1857, a new square lighthouse building was built, along with a new keeper's house. Original lamp was replaced in 1935, electrified in 1950, and automated in 1988. This fourth order, the fourth order Fresnel lens here, is one of the only 8 still used in Maine. 1,200-pound fog bell was replaced with a foghorn. It is still active and shows a fixed white light. Was leased to the state of Maine by the Coast Guard in 1989, sold to them in 1998. The lighthouse grounds are now part of the 154-acre Fort Point State Park. We've mentioned Fresnel lights during these lighthouses. Let me tell a little bit more about them as we're hovering here. 1828, there was a French physicist by the name of Augustin Fresnel. Came up with this new idea for lights. It was like a series of glass prisms all stacked on top of one another. Would magnify the light source many times over. And it came in six different sizes or orders initially. The first order was a huge piece of equipment, 8 to 10 feet in diameter, weighed over 6 tons, visible for 20 to 25 miles. We only had one of those in Maine. It was the Seguin Island down in southern Maine. And then they progressed down through the sixth order, which is the smallest, visible for 8 to 10 miles, probably weighed about 200 pounds. By 1858, almost all lighthouses had converted to the Fresnel lens. They still make them today. They make them out of plastic. They say if they made a first order today, the big one, out of glass, $6 million to make one. What they use them for today, traffic lights. Used to use them in auto headlights, theater projectors. U.S. Navy still uses them. Any aircraft carrier, any naval air station, it's the light the aviator focuses on when he comes into land. Keeps him on the proper glide slope. Even have a nickname for him. They call him the ball or the meatball. As I said, Maine Lighthouse Museum does have them on exhibit down there in Rockland, all except the first order, which was too big for him to handle.
Okay, this is now what makes today's trip truly fascinating. I've been making the point that this is the first time any commercial boat has made a Bar Harbor to Bangor round trip in one day. For anyone with a pleasure craft, that doesn't seem so far. Surely it can be done in a day. And it can. But there are few boats capable of carrying hundreds of passengers that can pull this off. These Bar Harbor Whale Watch boats are so fast that we don't even have to take the shortest route. The shortest route would take us back to Eggemonket Reach and the west side of Deer Isle. But we're going another 20 miles to a lighthouse on the east side of Deer Isle, and we'll go around Deer Isle. And eventually, we'll go back to Bar Harbor by way of Winter Harbor, zigzagging all over Frenchman's Bay. And we'll still get back to the dock a few minutes early. We're doing about 33 miles an hour on the way over to the next lighthouse called Eagle Island.
So here we have the Eagle Island Lighthouse. And actually there are 8 different Eagle Islands on the Maine coast. Probably the most well-known is in Casco Bay, and that was actually the home of Admiral Robert Peary, who discovered the North Pole. This lighthouse was originally known as the Eagle Island Point Light, and it sits at the east end of the 260-acre Eagle Island. First lit 1838 during the presidential administration of Martin Van Buren. It was one of the chain of lights near the mouth of the Penobscot River, which marked a clear path through this rocky bay, and was a host of lumber-carrying freighters that came up through here. They went up to the to Bucksport and to Bangor. 30-foot tower and dwelling were built of rubble stone with a fixed white light using whale oil. First keeper was John Spear. Made $350 a year. He actually died at the station and was briefly replaced by his widow. 1857, the rubble stone dwelling was replaced with a wooden one. And in 1858, the fourth order Fresnel lens was installed, was visible for 16 and a half miles. 1897, the 3-pound fog bell was replaced with a 42-pound one. Originally, keepers here had to supply their own boat, and finally in 1919 the government supplied them with a dory, which they had to row 2 miles to Deer Isle for their supplies for. They had to buy their own uniforms, supply their own food, and the first indoor toilet was 1949. Just in case you're keeping track of those sort of things. It was automated in 1959, and the Fresnel lens was replaced with a 30-millimeter lens with an electric lamp, which is powered by banks of batteries recharged by a diesel generator. Today it's all solar powered. Also, the light's characteristics were also changed from a flashing every 4 seconds, changed to a flashing every 4 seconds. Fog bell was turned off and replaced by a buoy just off the island. 1964, due to some vandalism in the area, Coast Guard decided to either sell the buildings or tear them down. Apparently no one was interested in removing them, so over many of the local protests, the Coast Guard destroyed the buildings, and they wouldn't let anybody salvage anything from the buildings. Also, during the destruction, they dropped the 4,200-pound fog bell into the water. They couldn't recover it, and later on, a fisherman by the name of Walter Shepard did recover it and it is now on exhibit at Great Spruce Head Island. Also, the Coast Guard were involved with the destruction of Two Bush Island Lighthouse. It was actually a Green Beret exercise that destroyed the buildings. And also Moose Peak Lighthouse was destroyed. And this led to many public protests, which actually resulted in the creation of the Maine Lights Program and the National Lighthouse Preservation Act. So some good did come out of it.
As we pull away from Eagle Island, it's about 3 in the afternoon. We're now going to go around Deer Isle and head for Stonington Harbor. We've got 5 more lighthouses to hit, and we might even veer off course.
So contrary to what you might think, we are not lost. Nor has the captain been drinking much.
That's coming up when Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine resumes in a moment on Sports Radio 92.9. The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is part 2 of a 2-part show. On Saturday, September 10th, Bar Harbor Whale Watch took its fast catamaran from Bar Harbor to Bangor. We're heading back to Bar Harbor now, getting a look at Maine from a completely different angle. Few Mainers ever get to see this part of their own state. The Maine coast we know consists of lobster boats and day sailors. But 150 years ago, it was a lot easier to get around by water than by land. You get a sense of what history was like when you visit the lighthouses that dot the coastline. Gene Torbeck is the lighthouse expert on board the Friendship 5 today, and we've just reached the Deer Island Thoroughfare Light.
Also known as Mark Island. And as you know, or probably know, there is another Mark Island. It is over in Winter Harbor area. It is where the Winter Harbor Light is located, and we will be going over there later on. All that remains of this pre-Civil War light station is the 20-foot square brick tower. It's now a wildlife refuge out here. The Deer Island Thoroughfare light, it's between Deer Isle to the north and smaller islands to the south. Pretty busy waterway in the 19th century, with all the granite quarries in the area and a very strong fishing industry here also. This island was bought from David Thurlow in 1856 for $175. And the light station built in 1857 on the west side of the 6-acre Mark Island was to help mariners negotiate this passage here. Thomas Colby Small, he also had 14 kids, but that's not the record. Actually, one of the lighthouses we normally go to, Baker Island, had a person there, a lightkeeper, Nathan Reed, who had 17 kids. That was the record. But anyway, Thomas Colby Small was the first keeper, and it was first lit on New Year's Day in 1858. Samuel Holden, a Civil War veteran, was a keeper out here from 1868 until his death in 1874. After his death, his wife Melissa Holden was a keeper for 2 more years. February 1935, the keeper Elmer Connery was stricken with an apparent heart attack. A tugboat reached the island with a local doctor. Connery was carried aboard the tug, but as the vessel reached Stonington Harbor, the ice was too thick for it to continue on. And the sick guy was transported in a lifeboat through a narrow channel in the ice. And he recuperated with his family on the mainland. In 1959, an explosion and fire badly damaged the keeper's house. A short time later, the light was automated. The Coast Guard crew was removed, and all the buildings except the tower were destroyed. Fog Bell was replaced with a continuously sounding horn, but at that time the neighbors complained that the new horn sounded like a bull moose call. So they reduced the power and relocated it to try and solve that problem. The lighthouse originally had a 4th order Fresnel lens, which was replaced with a solar-powered 25-millimeter plastic lens. Still an active lighthouse, with a white flash every 6 seconds and a range of about 6 miles. 1997, the Maine Lighthouse Selection Committee, which oversaw the transfer of 35 lights under the Maine Lights program, announced that the Island Heritage Trust would be the new owners of this light.
A few photos and we're off again on board the Friendship 5. From here, it's just about a straight shot to Bass Harbor, 18 miles across Jericho Bay, passing just north of Swans Island. Once out of the harbor, we can go full speed, so it takes about 40 minutes to get from this peninsula back to MDI. The day of this first ever tour coincided with Maine Open Lighthouse Day. So as we pull up to Bass Harbor Headlight, there's more than the usual number of people swarming around it. This lighthouse also predates the Civil War.
1858, first built. 1974 is when it was automated. If you do drive over here, you can walk around it like you see those people doing. Nice steps coming down over there. And walk all around it. You cannot go in it. The Coast Guard was using it for housing, but I understand they are no longer using it for housing, and they have some other plans for it. It does have a 4th order Fresnel lens up there. It is covered with a red sleeve, which gives you an occulting light. And an occulting light is one that is on longer than it is off, as opposed to a flashing light, which is off longer than it is on. There used to be a plaque up there that the park had put up, and it was designating what they thought was the worst shipwreck in the history of Maine. They thought it took place here. There is a ledge under us here. But they thought it was 1740, and it was a ship coming over from Ireland, heading to North Carolina via Philadelphia. They thought it ran aground here. They thought the name of it was the Grand Mission. But about 200 people on board, and everybody got to shore, but back in those days wasn't much in the way of civilization here. Eventually 20 people survived. A little later on, someone did a little more research. Found out there was a couple of errors in the story. There was a ship coming over from Ireland, 200 people, but the name of the ship was the Martha Eliza, not the Grand Mission. The name of the mission of the ship was the Grand Mission. And it didn't happen here. It happened up in the Bay of Fundy. So the park took down their plaque. Yeah, this is one of the most photographed, if not the most photographed. It's between here and the Portland Headlight, is what they always say, the two most photographed lights up here in Maine.
All right, a few more photos and we can bump it up to number 1 most photographed lighthouse in Maine. 7th order Fresnel lens, that's a Boy Scout with a flashlight.
And from there, if you went another 12 miles out, would be Mount Desert Rock, one of the furthest off the coast of Maine. It's about 25 miles out to Mount Desert Rock from Bar Harbor, one of the most remote. Nothing more than a ledge, about 600 yards long, 200 yards wide. They had to pay the keeper out there a premium wage. Most lighthouse keepers made about $350 a year. But if you were the keeper at at Mount Desert Rock, about $850 a year. They say that when they had a keeper out there, in the springtime, fishermen or lobstermen would go by, drop off a bucket of dirt. Keeper's wife would take it, tuck it into a little crevice. That was their flower garden for the year. We send College of the Atlantic students out there now. They'll spend the week out at Mount Desert Rock, do whale counts.
As it happens, I was just out to Mount Desert Rock a week before, on board the Atlanticat, an even bigger and faster Bar Harbor whale watch boat. While out there, I counted 2 whales, 2 humpbacks named Spoon and Sword. But that's a different story. Up next, we got a big surprise. We had planned this trip in the Friendship 5 to visit 10 lighthouses, and we had planned to get back to the Bar Harbor Pier by 6 p.m. We're early, an hour ahead of schedule. In a moment, we'll squeeze in an unexpected lighthouse. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket. History was made on September 10th. A Bar Harbor whale watch boat, the Friendship 5, took passengers from Bar Harbor to Bangor and back, stopping at lighthouses, forts, bridges, and points of history along the way. I got to host the event. And things are going so well that we're ahead of schedule. Gene Torbeck is the lighthouse expert on board. We've now hit 8 lighthouses so far in this tour. We did not expect to make this one number 9.
So contrary to what you might think, we are not lost. Nor has the captain been drinking much. We decided to give you a little extra bonus here. We're a little ahead of schedule. So this is Great Duck Island Lighthouse, about 12 miles out from Bar Harbor here. 1890, first built. 1986, automated. As you can see, everything is solar powered up there. Solar panels to the right of the keeper's house. Also behind the red brick building you see. And that red brick building is what houses the foghorn. And you hear it here. It goes 24/7 out here. You might see people up there, and if you do, that would be College of the Atlantic students. College of the Atlantic is the local college here in Bar Harbor. And I think I mentioned earlier, before I knew we were coming out here, that they'll send students out here. They'll live in the keeper's house. They do bird counts. This is a huge bird sanctuary. They say that about 20% of Maine's bird population nests out here. Herring gull, storm petrels, razorbills, guillemots. This is also the lighthouse that Nathan Reed had the record of the 17 kids. I think at one time there were three keepers out here, and they had so many kids between the three of them, they had to put a school out here. But that, as you recall, was days before TV, Wi-Fi. Only read so much. If you have binoculars, scan over there on the right side, probably between our 3 to 5 o'clock area, and you might be able to see Mount Desert Rock out there. Some days you can see very clearly. Other days there's too much haze. Yeah, we just spotted it. Probably about what?
6 o'clock.
Probably about 6 o'clock. Look back directly behind us, and you might see the tower sticking up. Another 12 miles out there, Mount Desert Rock.
We were talking a little bit about the birds that breed out here. The Gulf of Maine is a fascinating place because of our cold water and the Labrador Current that circulates in here to chill the water. It produces an awful lot of food, and so it's a very exciting place. A lot of the South Atlantic birds will come up here during their winter. So if you ever wonder if birds go north for the winter, the answer is yes. We have Wilson storm petrels. Probably, I was out there on Saturday at Mount Desert Rock out there, and the ocean was full of them. Great shearwaters were out there. So a lot of those southern birds come up here. In the meantime, this island right here is home to a lot of what's called Leach's storm petrels. Tiny birds, not much bigger than a swallow, and they nest in burrows under the soil. And we have thousands of them on this island. Sadly, they're nocturnal, so we don't see them much in daylight, but this is one of the biggest breeding areas in the world for Leach's storm petrels right out here. I don't know if they're still here, but earlier this year I was on this boat and we went by Great Duck, and I have never seen so many black guillemots in my life. The ocean was alive with them. Also, you will occasionally notice some flocks of common eiders in among the rocks. We passed them around the cove over there, and I wouldn't be surprised to see more. And again, these are in many cases flightless right now because they're molting.
Two more lighthouses to go, and a third that we're going to sneak by. Baker Island is right on our route, but that lighthouse is more in the center of the island, and we're going to skip by it. We're going about 9 miles across Frenchman's Bay to Winter Harbor. There's a lighthouse there on Mark Island that's easy to see when you're driving out the road to Schoodic Point. But unless you're on a boat, you can't get close to this one. We're on a boat, and we're close. The keeper's house and all the buildings are still here, but the lighthouse doesn't actually work anymore. It's been replaced.
Replaced by that red and green bell buoy you see off of our left side. That is what took the place of this lighthouse. Ever since then, it's been privately owned. One of the first owners, Bernice Richmond, she was a resident of Winter Harbor. And Winter Harbor is about 3 o'clock on the other side of Mark Island. You can see it over there. She was a novelist, wrote a couple children's books. One was called Our Island Lighthouse. She also planted a lot of rose bushes and flowers up there around the lighthouse. Several other people lived here after that. And then about, I think early 2000, maybe 2004, it was sold again. The price has gone up a little bit. Interior decorator, interior designer from New York City bought it. think it was 1.25 million. Spends his summers here. There you have a view of Winter Harbor now, right there at 3 o'clock. You can see it up there about 2 miles. If you remember Walter Cronkite, he used to spend his summers in Winter Harbor. Also a lady up there by the name of Ellen Dixon. And if you're from Philly, you might recognize her father, Eugene Dixon. He owned the Philadelphia 76ers, the NBA ball club back in the 1980s. But she had a great-grandfather, George Wiedner. He was a passenger on the Titanic. The Titanic actually went down about 900 miles north of where we are here. If you saw the movie, there's a scene of a guy giving his wife a ring as she crawls into a lifeboat. Well, that exact ring is worn by Ellen Dixon over here, been passed down to her. I think she's in her late 80s now. Also, a little more connection to the Titanic. Titanic was owned and operated by the White Star Line. White Star Line was owned by J.P. Morgan. He was a resident of Bar Harbor.
One more lighthouse to visit, and it's right at the entrance to Bar Harbor. As we're coming in, there's a big cruise ship coming out. This last lighthouse is on an island that's normally covered in seals and seabirds. But this adventure happened on September 10th, a little late in the season. Most of the wildlife is out doing something else. And maybe this isn't the prettiest lighthouse in Maine.
So this is Egg Rock Lighthouse. 1875, first built, lasted here until 1976 when it was automated. Nobody lives out anymore. Probably the first thing you notice about this lighthouse is sort of unusual. They put the tower right on top of the keeper's house. The reason being, not enough room to put it separately, so they built it right on top. As a result, it has a reputation in Maine of being the ugliest lighthouse in Maine. I tend to think it's more unusual. It's the only one like this. Building to the right is where the foghorn is. And this is one of the foghorns. I think 17 of our foghorns up here have been converted over to a new system this year. It's a Mariner radio activated sound system. And to turn it on, you just key in, I think it's 83 alpha on your VHF. Turns on the foghorn. Goes for about 60 minutes. If you look at the ledges up ahead of us there, the furthermost one in 1903 or 5, I can't remember which year it was, but one of those two. The battleship Massachusetts was up here in Bar Harbor on a port call, left Bar Harbor on a rainy, foggy day. Happened to strike that ledge. And they say that's one of the primary reasons they put the foghorn here. Not a good day for the captain or navigator, I'm sure. They probably ended up running special services in Diego Garcia. In 1935, there was an assistant keeper out here. Dalzell was his last name. But he started to row into Bar Harbor for some supplies, and that was the last they heard of him. Never found him. This is a big area for eagles out here, and also it's a big area for seals. Here's actually a seal poking his head up here right at our 11 o'clock. Looks like a harbor seal right here at 11 o'clock, got his head up. The naturalists who study the seals up here, they say they're seeing more and more bites on them up here, indicating that the great white sharks are coming up here. Great white's pretty common down around Cape Cod, but as our water temperature has warmed a couple degrees, the great whites are now coming up here. Plus, there's plenty of food for them. A lot of harbor seals.
Well, that's exciting. What makes the Gulf of Maine so famous is the cold water, producing a nearly endless supply of lobsters and plenty of food for whales, seals, and birds. But the Gulf is thought to be the fastest warming body of water on the planet. So maybe when future generations look back on the history we're creating now, they'll reminisce about a time when there weren't all those sharks and jellyfish out here. That's the funny thing about history. You're making it every day. This boat trip on the Friendship 5 was the first commercial vessel to run from Bar Harbor to Bangor and back in one day. We're even back about 20 minutes early.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Bob. It was a real treat to have your expertise and narrative all during the trip. So maybe everybody will join me in giving Bob Duchesne a nice round of applause for all his effort.
And that's Zach Kleiber, head naturalist for Bar Harbor Whale Watch. He really did all the work. All I did was sit up front of the top deck and marvel at the historic lighthouses, forts, and bridges, and occasionally point out a duck. This trip on September 10th was the first ever run from Bar Harbor to Bangor and back. We went around Mount Desert Island, through Eggemogan Reach, onto the Deer Isle Bridge into Blue Hill Bay, and up the Penobscot, and then returned around Deer Isle and Stonington, zipped over to Winter Harbor, and finally back to Bar Harbor. These fast catamarans can cover a lot of water in a hurry. This was the third major excursion Bar Harbor Whale Watch did over the summer. On one major voyage, they ran up the coast all the way to Canada, stopping at the lighthouses all along the way. Then they launched another lighthouse tour that traipsed all the way down to Rockland and Owl's Head. Foliage season is a favorite time to get on this boat. They've got some other special trips coming up when the leaves turn color in Acadia. Check them out at barharborwhales.com. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Doors Equipment, Bar Harbor Whale Watch, Napa Auto Parts, and EBS. We'll return next Saturday morning at 9 and Sunday morning at 8. This is Sports Radio 92.9, The Ticket.